Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Joe Griffiths. I'm the Director of Planning Best Practices for the Maryland Department of Planning, and I'm happy to welcome you all to our next installment in the Maryland Department of Planning webinar series addressing the newly adopted 8 planning principles. Today's webinar is titled Designing Adequate Public Facility Ordinances, otherwise known as APFOs, for Sustainable Growth. And I'm excited for the excellent panel that we have today. Next slide, please. You. One thing I want to point out for those APA, AICP folks out there, the APA just recently is updating their website, and I have been trying for the last 2 weeks to secure AICP credits for this webinar, and their website is just not working. I have multiple requests, emails, and voicemails in, but as of right now, we have not secured the AICP credits because they are being non-responsive. However, you can always get them after the webinar, and I will be diligent all week trying to get these credits, and I will send everybody who registered for this webinar, I will send you the number and let you know when the credits are active and ready. I know a lot of people are scrambling to get credits right now at the end of December, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. We're not the only AICP credit provider having this issue, so we appreciate your patience. Next slide. Thanks, David. I want to go over some housekeeping issues here real quick before we turn it over to the panel. Next slide, David. Make sure you're active on the screen, David, where the slides are. There we go. Thank you so much. Okay, so just some, back up one. Just hit up arrow. Well, I'll go, there we go. So I just want to point out, some housekeeping logistics. We are recording this. We'll post it on our website and share it with the audience. I want to distinguish between the chat and the Q&A. We encourage you to use the chat to share insights with the audience or with the panelists. If you know of a good resource or good examples related to APFOs, we can really enrich the learning environment if you all share with each other. So it's not just the panelists sharing with you, let's all share with each other. But if you have a question for the panel, please put it in the Q&A, which is showed at the bottom and circled, rather than in the chat. If you put questions in the chat, people will keep on adding other chat information and they'll be lost. They'll be scrolled all the way to the top of the screen. We'll never be able to find them. So please put your questions in the Q&A and chats in the chat. We will be saving Q&A for the end of the webinar. So thank you very much. Next slide, I'll introduce our first panelist. All right. David Dahlstrom, AICP, has been a planner with the Maryland Department of Planning for over 13 years and, among other duties, serves as the manager of local jurisdiction annual reports and biennial APFO reports. David has also served as the coordinator of the APFO work group of the Maryland Sustainable Growth Commission. David has over 35 years of planning experience. He earned a master's degree in urban and regional planning from Florida State University. Prior to moving to Maryland, David worked at the Florida Department of Community Affairs and the South Florida Regional Planning Council, and has extensive experience with Florida's concurrency management systems, the teeth of growth management. Now I'll turn it over to you, David. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joe. A warm welcome to our guests and panelists and the audience for participating in this webinar. Our agenda for the panel today will include the following. I will present a brief overview of the new Maryland Sustainable Growth Planning Principles, our new MDP APFO resource webpage, and I will provide an overview of Maryland's APFO reporting requirements. Sarah Kamai Hoffman from the National Center for Smart Growth will provide an overview of a recently completed study on APFOs in Maryland and their impact on housing and schools. Jason Groth and Melissa Hively from Charles County Planning will present the evolution of their county APFO over recent years, their APFO for schools and their APFO for transportation. And Eric Lashinsky from the City of Annapolis Planning will speak about their transportation APFO, particularly non-automotive, recreation, and public water access, fee and lieu inadequacy, and coordination with Anne Arundel County on school APFO capacity. Following the webinar, attendees will be able to, one, describe APFOs in Maryland and have access to available APFO resources, describe the APFO modification process and lessons learned from municipal and county jurisdictions, two, design APFOs that facilitate housing supply and affordability with adequate infrastructure, enable improved mobility, enhance recreational amenities, and three, navigate the complexities of school APFOs. In order to advance from smart growth, the Maryland Department of Planning began examining the 12 planning visions contained in the Maryland Land Use article in early 2024. We began to question whether the visions were really serving the planning community today and decided to hold regional roundtables with jurisdictions across the state. From April through June, MDP staff met with planning directors of jurisdictions that have planning and zoning authority, with the goal of gaining insight on their thoughts of the local comprehensive planning process and the drafted new planning principles. The recurring themes we heard included simplifying the process, especially in the smaller jurisdictions. We also heard that they felt that the proposed new planning principles were more aligned with the required elements of the comprehensive plan. We reached positive feedback that the planning principles included equity, resilience, and place. Based on that feedback, MDP created draft legislation in the fall of 2024 that was introduced as Maryland's 8 Sustainable Growth Planning Principles. On April 8th, 2025, Governor Moore signed Maryland's Sustainable Growth Planning Principles into law. The planning principles create a framework that emphasizes Maryland's land use and development priorities and allows flexibility in how these principles are applied by various user types. The 8 principles, as shown in the diagram, include land, housing, transportation, economy, ecology, equity, resilience, and place. A key concept for today's webinar is that APFOs intersect with the land, resiliency, economy, housing, transportation, and place principles in some fashion, meaning APFOs can be a part of an implementation tool chest. The Maryland Department of Planning has developed a guide and dashboard as tools to advance sustainable growth in Maryland. Released on December 3rd, the Maryland 2025 Sustainable Growth Implementation Guide is now available on the MDP website. Currently, there is a link to the guide on the homepage located at maryland.planning.gov, and a clickable link to the website will be available when this video is posted. The guide addresses the 8 new planning principles and includes 23 key performance indicators or KPIs. The Sustainable Growth Implementation Guide website provides a dashboard for each principle. The dashboard of the 23 key performance indicators was developed by our Planning and Data Analysis section. The Sustainable Growth Implementation Guide website also provides case examples for each principle. It is anticipated that the dashboard and case studies will be updated periodically. If you have any example case studies, please reach out to us and share them. There are 4 sections in the resource guide. The first is a table of policy and legislative tools, followed by similar tables for project development guides, data assessment and engagement tools, and funding and incentive programs. The 8 planning principles rest upon the foundation of 3 concepts. Improving human well-being. For example, the land principle means development within the priority funding area is served by adequate sewer capacity. Mitigating climate change for the transportation principle means that considering non-automotive alternatives. Growing economic opportunity for the housing principle means providing a greater range of housing choices and affordability. Properly crafted and implemented APFOs are seen as a tool to ensure that these guiding concepts are achieved. How do APFOs contribute to sustainable growth? Key concept is that properly crafted and locally implemented APFOs benefit all community members and direct growth to planned growth areas. It aligns growth with infrastructure capacity, ensures long-term service reliability, and limits growth to occur at the pace the community can support. discourages leapfrog development, prevents overloading treatment systems or classrooms, and can align land use with environmental carrying capacity. What are the benefits of an APFO? A key concept is that APFOs leverage capital of all kinds, including inducing developer agreements and developer contributions. They support impact fees and justify the cost or rate of the fee. They support special taxing districts, support tax increment financing or TIF. They steer capital to growth areas. They can make it easier to attract state and federal grants, attract P3 partners, give clear signals where and when local infrastructure investments are made, and can ensure every public dollar is strategically targeted. This is the Maryland Department of Planning homepage located at maryland.planning.gov. An APFO website has been created and it was launched last week. Under the Planning Services tab, select Local Government Planning, then select Local Assistance. The APFO link will be the top choice. They're in alphabetical order. When you are on the MDP Local Assistance website, I also encourage you to explore the Maryland Zoning Checkup Guide. You'll find the zoning checkup at the bottom of the local assistance list. APFO at the top, zoning checkup at the bottom, alphabetical. The zoning checkup is a tool intended to be used by small jurisdictions as an illustrated instructional guide to help navigate zoning issues that provide a zoning tutorial for citizen planning commissioners and planners. A new topic, parking standards, will be posted soon. On the APFO website, you will find a list of APFO resources. The resource guide will expand over time, but now you will find resources such as the Department of Legislative Service inventory that links to every county APFO ordinance in Maryland, the Department of Legislative Services map of APFO counties, the National Center for Smart Growth Report 2025. That's going to be posted soon, and Sarah will speak about this report in her presentation. The MDP APFO inventory report from 2012 was our first APFO inventory. The MDP APFO work group report from 2013 was my first report on Maryland APFOs. The MDE, Maryland Department of Environment wastewater treatment plant 3-year flow data from 21 to 23. This is the only place you will find is this data is on our website. And then state rated school capacity identified by Dakota, Maryland for school rated capacities on there. Other resources will include the Maryland Department of Planning, Maryland Annual Estimates and Projections for School Enrollments, the Interagency Commission IAC on School Construction Procedures Guide, some local best practices case examples, such as the Charles County Adequate Public Facilities Manual. Charles County staff will be here today they can speak more on that. The State Highway Administration roadway traffic counts for state roads, and an example APFO ordinance from a small town of Thurmont, Maryland, which I think works as a good outline if you are not familiar with APFOs. If a jurisdiction in Maryland adopts an APFO, there is a requirement to report on every development restriction in the priority funding area. We have included this requirement in our local government annual report template. As a reminder, we call this the long form because it lists all the measures and indicators, and APFO measurements are listed or included in the annual report. The APFO reporting is only required by jurisdictions with adopted APFOs. The APFO report is due by July 1st of each even year and covers the reporting period of the previous 2 calendar years. APFO reports for 2024 and 2025 are due by July 1st, 2026. The APFO report must address what type of infrastructure is monitored and may trigger development approval restrictions or require a developer to address deficiencies, and it has to be listed for each facility type, for schools, for roads, water, sewer, stormwater, healthcare, fire, police, solid waste, whatever category you may have in that APFO ordinance. The jurisdiction must report if the APFO has impacted development approvals within the PFA, and the jurisdiction must identify the location of the restriction on a map. The jurisdiction must describe what is causing each restriction. They must identify what is the proposed resolution of each restriction. They must identify what is the estimated date to resolve the restriction, and they must identify when a development restriction has been addressed, what was the resolution that lifted the restriction, and when a development restriction has been addressed, when was it lifted. Each December, MDP must prepare a local jurisdictional annual report and submit the report to the General Assembly. A summary of various measurement indicators are required to be reported by jurisdictions with planning and zoning authority, and they are listed in our annual report, including a report on APFO restrictions in the priority funding area. The MDP annual report cover on the right is our 2024 report. Our 2025 report will be published by the end of this month. And then in this slide, this is a summary of Howard County, what they reported for APFO restrictions. And I'll just read it to you that 21 elementary schools were closed, 3 middle schools were closed, but no high schools were closed for new residential developments. This resulted in 959 housing units and 21 different subdivision plans to be put on hold. They also reported that in their fiscal year 25 budget, they included construction funding for 7 schools to add student capacity. So this is an example of what you'll find in our APFO reports and our MDP annual report. And with that, I'm now going to turn this this presentation over to Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Let me introduce Sarah here.
Oops.
Sarah Kamai-Hoffman is a second-year Master of Community Planning student at the University of Maryland. She is driven to use urban planning as a catalyst to foster health, happiness, and creativity among youth and broader communities. Sarah's foundational experience lies in education and youth engagement, having served in 3 AmeriCorps Education Service programs. She continues to apply this expertise by supporting a built environment after-school program through the University of Maryland and tutoring K-2 students. Her commitment to community well-being also extends to food access and sustainability. She works at farmers markets in the Washington, D.C. region and interned for a food education program in Washington, D.C. In graduate school, Sarah has gained necessary planning skills through her work as a teaching and research assistant for the National Center for Smart Growth and the Stormwater Infrastructure Resilience and Justice Lab, and as a summer fellow with the Montgomery County Council. Sarah was born in Japan, grew up in Northern Virginia, and earned a double degree in political science and criminology from the Ohio State University. Welcome, Sarah.
Go ahead and share my screen. All right, so hello everyone, my name is Sarah Hoffman. I'm a second-year graduate student in the Master of Community Planning program at the University of Maryland. I'm also a graduate research assistant with the National Center for Smart Growth, which is affiliated with the university. My presentation will be covering research that I completed through NCSG during the spring 2025 semester on adequate public facilities ordinances, or APFOs, in Maryland. This research was completed under the supervision of Dr. Casey Dawkins and Policy Associate Wendell Desir. So to begin, as David said, this was sort of built off of the APFO work group report from 2013. So with that report in the previous year was an inventory of APFOs in Maryland, but since then the inventory had not been updated and MDP had received requests for an updated inventory. So in 2025, they reached out to NCSG to update the inventory, and they also requested a literature review on the relationship between APFOs and housing outcomes, and a set of best practices to supplement the inventory and review. So this is where I stepped in as a graduate research assistant to complete these 3 components. To create the updated inventory, I read through county and municipal ordinances and identified those with APFOs. Those that were identified were categorized further across factors such as the facilities covered and exempted developments. And then for the literature review and best practices, I reviewed journal articles and government and institutional reports. So to start with the inventory and looking at counties in Maryland, the column on the left shows the category, the middle count shows the count of counties, and the right column shows the percentage. So we can see in that second row that over half of Maryland's 24 counties have an APFO. And when we break this down by facility, when we see that all of those counties that had APFOs, all of them had schools and roads requirements, and then water, sewer, and fire and EMS were the next most common facilities. When we look at municipalities, in that second row, we see a smaller share of municipalities have APFOs, with less than a quarter having them. But again, we see that schools, roads, water, and sewer are the most common facilities covered. If we compare the two, some differences stand out. For example, police are a more common requirement among municipalities than in counties. But overall, over a quarter of all jurisdictions in Maryland have APFOs, with schools, roads, water, and sewer being the most commonly covered facilities. These facilities are likely the most common because their expansion requires major capital investments and multi-year planning, and are seen by residents as essential public services. Common exempted developments among counties and municipalities were non-residential and commercial developments, age-restricted housing, minor subdivisions, mixed-use development, affordable housing, and low-traffic producing subdivisions. Now, looking at a map, we can see those counties with APFOs in gray and those municipalities in yellow. Not surprisingly, all counties in the Baltimore-Washington region have APFOs, which may reflect higher growth pressures. Notably, Baltimore City does not have one, and there are no APFOs in the farthest western, northeastern, and southeastern portions of the state. This may suggest lower development pressures, different growth patterns, or a reliance on other tools to manage capacity and growth. We can see that most municipalities that have APFOs fell under counties that also have them, although there's the exception of Cambridge and Dorchester County. Now, moving on to the literature review, I reviewed the relationship between APFOs and the 5 housing outcomes that are listed on the left here. For supply, first, APFOs can restrict housing supply when poorly coordinated with capital improvement programs or if they contribute to a lengthy approval process. Next, from the review, I found that APFOs can increase existing home prices, and APFO policy in Cabarrus County, North Carolina, produced an immediate 2.3% increase in existing single-family home prices. Other studies in Florida and California have produced similar findings. The research indicated that APFOs can increase existing home prices both through reductions in new housing availability and anticipated amenities that people were willing to pay more for. In terms of affordability, I found no conclusive findings. This is likely due to the fact that stronger predictors of housing affordability exist, such as inclusionary zoning and density allowances. Next, I found that APFOs are marginally associated with multifamily housing. This might be as developers seek to offset added development costs by increasing density and therefore potential returns on investment. Finally, I found inconclusive findings on the relationship between APFOs and compact or sprawl development. Some research shows limited effects, while others show APFOs can displace development away from regulated areas toward less developed areas or areas with less restrictive policies. One caveat to this literature review was that I found limited research that isolates the effects of APFOs on housing outcomes. Instead, research tends to evaluate the entire package of growth management or land use regulations. This made it difficult to disentangle the relationship between specific policies and specific outcomes, but it does offer a more realistic picture of how APFOs interact with other policies. So moving on to schools. Schools are significant in Maryland, one, because they are one of the most popular facilities covered. They're also important to consider because they're among the largest expenditures for state and local governments. There's already this interdependent relationship between schools and housing through local funding that's tied to property taxes. There have been recent discussions about the impact of increased class sizes on educational quality. There are also School-related decisions and policies often inspire passion and engagement at the local level. And finally, there are equity concerns that come with school segregation and disparities in educational access. So some of the challenges that come with implementing the school's requirement of APFOs. In Maryland, school adequacy requirements have previously driven most residential development moratoria, which means that they are a particularly powerful component of APFOs. This can also be a difficult requirement to coordinate, given that school boards are often a separate governing entity from local legislative bodies. Some research has also shown that they have been used to avoid school rezoning and boundary redrawing conversations that are necessary for integration. Most critical of all is in some places, there might be a lack of understanding about what is driving school enrollment, and this will be explored further in the next slide. And finally, each of the potential solutions to APFOs to overcapacity comes with drawbacks. So temporary relocatable classrooms are a quick and cheap solution, but poor environmental conditions and negative health impacts can make them unattractive. Redrawing attendance boundaries can more evenly spread out school capacity, but this is a sort of politically fraught decision as people move to areas to send children to certain schools. And there are also concerns about travel times to schools with this decision. And finally, new school construction is sort of the optimal choice, but it can be slow and costly and requires proactive planning of school facilities. So going back to that point about understanding what's driving school enrollment growth, an example of this is in Montgomery County. The planning department conducted a study of what types of residential development were driving school enrollment, and they found that most enrollment stemmed from turnover in existing units rather than new development. Furthermore, new multifamily units accounted for less than 5% of enrollment growth. Therefore, in this case, the APFO targeted new development, particularly new multifamily development, but this meant that it was an ineffective tool to respond to school capacity issues. So in response, the county eliminated capacity requirements and instead implemented a payment plan for developers that supports school construction. So a common recommendation is for jurisdictions to gather further information and analysis on what is driving school enrollment in their jurisdiction to better tailor their APFOs. So last, we'll go over some best practices. These were the 9 best practices that were developed based on the reviewed research. And you can read more about each of these in the report once it's published on the website, but I'll explain further 4 of them. So first is tailored to support multimodal transportation. Most jurisdictions in Maryland only consider road and automobile adequacy tests for their transportation requirement. However, there are limitations to this approach. These types of requirements can complicate the path towards growth management objectives, such as reducing car dependency by funding road improvements at the expense of other transit modes. So ways that multimodal transportation can be supported through APFOs is using different metrics to measure road adequacy, adopting a corridor level approach that holistically considers transportation adequacy, considering the adequacy of other transportation modes such as bicycles, walking, and transit. And some jurisdictions also categorize the jurisdiction into transportation areas to reflect current or expected zoning, density, urban form, and transit infrastructure. And in these areas, priority can be given to other transit modes over cars. Next, we'll discuss the sort of middle two, collaborate to update school planning and collaborate within and between jurisdictions together. So key takeaway from this report is collaboration between planning departments and school boards. Planning departments should share, discuss information gathered from school adequacy tests and research on the kinds of development driving school enrollment growth. And then on the other hand, school boards can provide information to planning departments on specific school capacity issues, capital improvements needs, and other concerns expressed by staff and families. And then together, the two bodies can collaborate on mitigation options and identify priority areas for facility improvements. And this recommendation extends to other departments and agencies that manage facilities covered by APFOs, such as transportation departments, public works departments, and police and fire departments. And then finally, on the right, we have developed a variety of alternatives to adequacy. Flexibility should be adopted to support visions that were laid out in comprehensive and other plans. This means producing strategies that more flexibly allow for development in areas targeted for growth while still managing the impacts of growth. This could include phase development strategies, multiple mitigation options for developers, and a pipeline option for developers who might be willing to pay higher fees to move forward with development. So in conclusion, APFOs remain a key growth management tool in Maryland. However, it is worth reiterating that APFOs are growth management, not a growth control tool. Therefore, their design, implementation, and coordination with other policies should seek to accommodate development rather than strictly limit development. The strength of APFOs, though, is that there is room for flexibility in their design, implementation, and coordination, and jurisdictions should review their APFOs to ensure they're producing desired and positive outcomes. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. And while David's bringing up the slides, I just wanted to say that we're very excited. I shared the link to the webpage earlier, and we will be publishing Sarah's full report, which goes into a lot more details of this later this week. And I also wanted to say that, one, Sarah's work was kind of an impetus for this webinar and the webpage itself. And we've collaborated closely since, but all the panelists you'll hear from for the rest of today's webinar Sarah identified their jurisdictions in a report as demonstrating best practices. So we're glad to combine all this, to really work closely with our local governments, with our institutions of higher learning like the University of Maryland and National Center for Smart Growth, to share what the resources we've developed and we'll continue to develop. All right, so next I'm going to move on to our Charles County colleagues who'd like to share their best practices. I'm going to give you two bios right now. They're going to go one after the other. First, as the director of the Charles County Department of Planning and Growth Management, Jason Groth, AICP, leads a team of over 100 full-time employees that manage land use planning, development entitlements, civil engineering, permit review, and public transportation. He has over 28 years of experience in the planning and development industry, including 20 years of management and leadership. His expertise includes the planning and policy development of transportation, land use, housing, water resources, economic development, emergency management, conservation, recreation, and adequate public facilities. There's a long list before we could even get to the topic of today's webinar. Melissa Hively is a planner too with Charles County, Maryland, where she oversees the Adequate Public Facilities Program and reviews development applications to ensure compliance with local regulations. Her role involves close collaboration with internal departments and external agencies to safeguard the capacity and integrity of public infrastructure to support responsible growth. Melissa began her career as a paralegal in a private land use practice where she developed a strong foundation in zoning, subdivision, and regulatory frameworks. Her transition to public service began as a planning technician before advancing to her current role. With a unique blend of legal and planning experience, Melissa brings a practical, solutions-oriented perspective to land use and development review. Outside of work, Melissa enjoys traveling, reading, and spending time with her cats. I'll turn it over to you, Jason.
Thank you, Joe. All right. Let me find the right screen. Okay, should be up.
Looks great. Thanks, Jason.
All right, thanks. So as Joe said, we're here to talk about Charles County's Adequate Public Facilities Ordinance. Just for a little context, Charles County is located 16 miles south of Washington, D.C. in the coastal plain area, pretty flat where we are. We're predominantly a bedroom community to D.C., and we're the second fastest growing county in Maryland. We're attractive because we're more affordable than the inner suburbs in the district, and also because we have good schools, shopping, and a lot of rural character. So basics of the APFO for Charles County. The first version of the APFO was introduced in 1992 with that particular zoning ordinance update. So our APFO is embedded in the zoning ordinance. And essentially, its intention is to ensure infrastructure keeps pace with growth and ensure that developers are making the necessary improvements so that their particular development wasn't burdening the adequacy of systems in the county. Our particular APFO covers water and sewer, roads, school capacity, and rural fire suppression resources, which is kind of unique. We're going to take a quick look at how this works. So we're honored that the Maryland Department of Planning and the analysis highlighted our adequate public facilities manual. And this is the how-to guide. So essentially, Section 297 of our county code is the zoning ordinance, and subsection 256 is the APFO itself. It creates the regulatory framework for development controls. The way we do this is we control it based on we withhold subdivision plan approvals, such as preliminary subdivision plans or site development plans, which are the case for mixed-use developments and multifamily. And that ends up being the governor on adequacy of facilities. This ordinance refers to the APF manual, which the screen is on the right, which has the procedures and the guidance necessary to guide developers through the process. And then, of course, our planning commission is the approving authority on adequacy of facilities and/or mitigation strategies. So just a quick honorable mention of these two items: water and sewer and rural fire suppression are items in our APFO. I'm not going to focus on them today, but just to give you a little bit of flavor, the water and sewer section is actually reserved for future use. We have one quick blurb in there that's specific to water in rural areas, where we prohibit final plat approval until the developer is able to get water appropriation permits for individual wells for those rural homes. So that there is a governor there. But for the most part, we use other documents, as Sarah had mentioned earlier, as the controls on adequacy of water and sewer, as well as rural fire suppression. More specifically, the water and sewer ordinance in the county basically requires developers to do an in-depth analysis of both the water and sewer systems to ensure that there's adequacy in those systems to serve their community or their project. And if there isn't, they have to propose improvements, which we approve, to ensure that adequacy. As far as rural fire suppression, this is a little bit unique, like I mentioned earlier, and it applies to development only in rural areas outside of a water and sewer service area. And more specifically, it requires supplemental water sources if there isn't one within a 4-mile round trip distance of a newly proposed rural subdivision. And what this means is they would either have to install a large scale water tank or create access such as a siphon or hydrant to a pond or lake nearby. And that it's a little bit unique in that it's not necessarily there to fight fires firsthand, but in a rural area, it gives firefighters a resource to refill and try to meet the demands of a really aggressive fire. Okay, so schools. This is the more meaty part of the presentation. The APFO generally governs growth based on available capacity in our school system. We use a student yield factor per housing type. For example, a townhome and/or a single-family home in Charles County right now generates a student yield of about 0.46 to 0.48, so about a half a student per household. And so we regularly check that on an annual basis based on number of building permits per housing type versus student enrollments. And we compare that every year and update that number constantly. The APFO also has incentives for exemptions of desired housing types, such as mixed use or multifamily, and we'll get more into that in a minute. And of course, there's exemptions, much like Sarah mentioned in the best practices, which exempts 55 and older age-restricted communities, as well as minor subdivisions from the APFO. So a minor subdivision in Charles County is no more than 7 lots. So the school APFO was included in the very first version of our APFO in 1992. And again, it was intended to address school overcrowding. The way we do this is we withhold subdivision plat approval or site development plan approval until an allocation is granted. And the way we did this is we originally averaged the school capacity together for all 3 levels. So we would, designate the location of a project with respect to the elementary, middle, and high. And this became awkward because if your high school, say, had lots of capacity, but your elementary didn't, when you average them together, the project may get allocations, meaning capacity in the system, but you may be overcrowding one of those schools, such as, say, the elementary, by doing that. We'll get more, go a little deeper in that in a second. Relocatable classrooms, much like mentioned earlier, with a way to accommodate when the school becomes over capacity, so otherwise known as trailers. And those mainly were happening in the growth areas. And then, of course, we would have annual meetings with our Board of Education and elected officials to allocate the or approve the allocatable capacity to particular projects. So how did this process evolve over time? So as I mentioned, the original APFO was 1992, and specific to schools, this isn't necessarily in the APFO, but I thought this was really worth mentioning. We changed from a developer impact fee to a school construction excise tax, which is an ad valorem tax, in 2003. And in essence, the reason we did that was because the impact fee in Maryland was capped at $7,500 per housing unit, and the county's share of school construction was well exceeding that. So we switched to an excise tax with the help of our local legislature to ensure that we could keep pace and raise that excise tax to keep up with the cost. Our excise tax today is around $20,000 per household, whether if it's a single family or a townhome. Multifamily is a little bit less, but it's not too far behind. Moving on specifically to the APFO changes in 2005, that averaging became a real problem, so we needed to make some changes. We limited the available capacity to the most limited receiving school. So if the elementary school was the most limited of the elementary, middle, or high, that was the least common denominator, and that was what was used to grant allocations. That way, the intention was never to over allocate that most limited school. And so we also created a significant waiting list by doing this. So by lowering the bar for all three schools based on the most limited school, the waiting list for development got quite lengthy. And it nearly locked out all options for multifamily projects due to the high number of allocations they need. Also in 2005, we started allowing developer contributions to forward fund schools. So essentially, in addition to the school excise tax, we were now allowing developers to pay to forward fund what ultimately would be the missing state share of funding, because usually we get the state contribution in the rears. So by forward funding, we're able to pay for it up front and seek reimbursement for the state share later. In 2013, after these 2005 changes, we found that there were still issues or challenges. And so we formed a school allocation task force of stakeholders, which was everybody from local elected officials, staff from both the county government as well as the Board of Education, elected Board of Education members, and even teachers union members and developers. That resulted in a report in 2015, and we took many aspects of that report and made staff recommendations for formal changes to the policy in 2016. In essence, the recommendations or changes were to discontinue the developer contributions and continue with the excise tax only. And the reason for that was, while it wasn't proven, perception can become reality, and the feeling was that developers we're going to soon overwhelm the school system with students. And it was really hard to prove otherwise, because there is a delay from when the students show up in the system. Some other changes that we made were allowing 110% of each school's capacity in terms of allocations. So if a school held 1,000 students, we allocated up to a capacity of 1,100, because nearly all of our schools in the areas of demand had relocatable classrooms, and we were no longer using those in the capacity calculation. And while that sounds counterintuitive in terms of overcrowding, the state funding formula requires that you demonstrate being over capacity in order to get any of their funding to build new schools. So in essence, it forces local jurisdictions to have an overage of capacity. And so that's why we recommended the 110%. And we did get buy-in from the Board of Education that they could handle that. And then finally, in the 2016 changes, we allow for using the capacity of new schools that were in the capital program. In other words, schools to be built within 18 months of them opening. And that was a very conservative measurement, because when we grant these school allocations, it's generally 2 to 3 years before students show up in households based on the process. Okay, so some challenges with the policy. Even after the 2016 changes, we had a backlog of projects that was significant, some waiting on the list for over 10 years for allocations. Multifamily projects were still stagnant. Weren't getting any multifamily projects. It's because of the sheer number of allocations they need at one time. A 250 unit apartment building or complex would need 250 allocations, and that just wasn't available under this policy. Housing was starting to be limited to one Planet Une development in the county because they had an exemption to this APFO policy that existed since the 1970s. And so we were really not getting the development in all the areas we desired. And then the timing of allocations had become so unpredictable that we needed to make some changes. And finally, we really needed some incentives to promote affordable housing and mixed use development because they could not get the allocations necessary to be successful. And then starting to round out this part of the presentation, we had our 2020 policy changes, which is what is in effect today. So what did we do? We gave 100% allocation to priority projects. And what do I mean by 100%? I mean, if your project contained at least 25% affordable housing units and the rest were market rate, you got 100% of your allocations for the entire project. So this really incentivized affordable housing. And I do predict that in the future, we're going to lower this percentage raise this percentage so that you have to have more affordable housing units in your project in order to benefit from this part of the policy. But for now, that's what we needed to get started. This policy change also allowed 100% of the allocations for transit-oriented development or mixed-use projects, and then also any project within our urban redevelopment district would also get 100% of their allocations, which is where we were seeking redevelopment. Couple more things. We created a cap on the allocations for priority projects. These projects above that I just mentioned were classified as priority projects. We had to place a cap on there of 650 units a year. And that was just to ensure or give some comfort to the elected officials that we weren't going to overrun the receiving schools. And then for the waiting list that had gotten so long, we set a 6-year limit. And this was retroactive when this policy took effect. And I can tell you as of 2025, 5 years later, that list went from roughly 24 projects down to 4 projects. And then, of course, ultimately it created predictability for everyone. Final thoughts here. Prior developer contributions, allowed for many schools to be built. So despite the discontent that some had, all that funding we received enabled us to catch up. New schools allowed for easier redistricting and allowed us to fix overcrowding, and that's seen today. And we had a very supportive school superintendent, which was extremely helpful with redistricting. School construction created that capacity that we needed to relieve the overcrowding. And then our local elected officials were very eager to support us through funding the operating costs, which is about $10 million a school. So that was a key piece. Quick lessons learned. Waiting lists down to 4 projects, like I mentioned. Numerous multifamily projects were built, and many are on the way still. We created the most significant incentive for our redevelopment area after it had been rezoned almost 15 years ago. We are now seeing many projects underway, significantly more affordable housing choices in the county. Most schools are no longer overcrowded. And some key lessons learned really quickly on the way out here. The need to get the support of your elected officials, create partnerships with your schools, your elected officials, your developers. You really need to communicate the problem to the stakeholders to bring it home, and you got to be bold with your solutions. So that concludes my part of the presentation, and now I'm going to pass it to Melissa.
Thanks, Jason. Give me one moment. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Melissa Hively, and I am a planner here with Charles County. Today, I'm going to be talking about our roads element of our adequate public facilities. The Charles County APF manual provides guidance for interpretation, administration, and application of the roads element of the county's APFO. We strive to emphasize transparency so applicants and the public can see exactly how adequacy is measured through clear, detailed standards like the level of service thresholds, trip generation rates, and intersection delay criteria. By publishing these standards and requiring consistent reporting across all of our development applications, we hope to create predictability and open communication between the county and the development community. This starts with early evaluation. When a development application is still early in its planning phases, we require an informal step called a preliminary adequate public facilities analysis, or simply a PAPF. This step gives applicants a sense of potential capacity issues before they invest heavily in design by flagging concerns early and reducing surprises and encouraging collaboration between staff and the developers. The PAPF will analyze the projected trip generation by using the latest edition of the Institute of Transportation Engineers Trip Generation Manual, or the ITE. If a project is projected to generate fewer than 35 peak hour trips, then a traffic impact study is not required. For those projects that do cross this threshold, a traffic impact study is required. And as part of that PAPF step, we will provide detailed parameters that outline the specific intersections and road links that the applicant has to study, as well as the background developments that they need to include in their analysis. The manual provides detailed guidance, which is nearly 3 pages, so I'm not going to go into details, on the scope and expectations so developers know upfront what data is acceptable and how trip generation and level of service should be calculated. We feel that this clarity reduces confusion and eases the burden on applicants to help ensure that the studies are complete and consistent. The traffic impact study is required to be reviewed and approved before the preliminary subdivision or site development plan can receive approval. If the traffic impact study finds that the roads or intersections are going to be inadequate, then mitigation is required. And mitigation is intended to offset the development's impact. It's required to either be physical mitigation, like adding turn lanes or widening intersections or installing traffic signals, or by a fee in lieu that contributes to an improvement project. The proposed mitigation is subject to a public process and must be approved by the Planning Commission. Our mitigation requirements are intended to ensure that the growth is supported by real, tangible upgrades to our transportation system. So what have we learned? Flexibility. I mentioned that we allow for a fee in lieu instead of physical mitigation. This is a relatively recent addition to our APF program. We found that adhering to a strict rule that only allows physical mitigation left us without feasible options in cases where a failing facility couldn't be improved. So for example, we have a project near the intersection of MD 228 and US 301, which would have had to mitigate that intersection, which really isn't reasonable to expect a developer to make improvements at that scale. So instead of getting no improvements or losing that development altogether, we permitted this developer to contribute financially to an improvement project for another nearby intersection that was still impacted. We've also supported flexibility in other areas of our APF manual, like allowing applicants to appeal to the study parameters or to include consideration of alternative trip generation factors. This balance between firm standards and reasonable flexibility makes the process more effective and adaptable. Cumulative effects. One of the biggest challenges is the cumulative effect of developments. We do attempt to account for this in our policies by requiring traffic studies to include an analysis of the background developments or approved developments that haven't been built yet, and a 1% annual growth factor, but we know it's not perfect. We've heard concerns from the development community and even our own planning commission about fairness and accuracy when it comes to a developer's impacts, but we've also heard concerns from our public about congestion on our roads. So it's a challenge that we are continuously trying to balance. Delays and disagreements. We learned that one of our biggest sources of delays was disagreements over how far a traffic impact study should extend. To reduce the back and forth and provide consistency, we added clear language to the manual that defines the study area boundaries up front, tying our scoping standards to our septic tier map, because it distinguishes between our urban and suburban areas and our rural areas. This change streamlines the review process and ensures fairness across the project and still allows applicants to request an appeal if they believe flexibility is warranted. And finally, human touch. So while this isn't formally addressed in our APFO, another valuable lesson is that numbers and models alone don't always capture the full picture. So our adequacy criteria rely heavily on models and traffic counts, but we've learned that incorporating a human element can provide a more accurate representation of how our road networks function. So for example, one project's data didn't indicate that mitigation was required at an intersection, but field observations and photographs revealed really significant backups. So by bringing this real world evidence to the applicants and the approving board, we were able to demonstrate that the need for improvements. And eventually the developer did agree and we ended up getting those improvements. So this underscores the importance of completing complementing technical analysis with on the ground insight. So in conclusion, our policies are built on transparency and early evaluation, cumulative impact analysis, clear guidance and flexibility, and mitigation. So together, these principles help ensure that development proceeds responsibly and infrastructure keeps pace so our community can continue to thrive. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. And we'll have one panelist left. David, if you could share that. There we go. Excellent. Okay. Eric Lashinsky, AICP, is the Chief of Comprehensive Planning for the City of Annapolis, where he focuses on a broad range of urban policy areas, including housing, land use, natural resources, mobility, and cultural arts. He led the city's most recent comprehensive plan update, Annapolis Ahead 2040, which includes an ambitious vision for the city's future. A native Annapolitan, Eric worked for over 20 years as an advocate, architect, planner, and urban designer in other places, including New York City, Houston, Austin, and Baltimore, before returning to Annapolis in 2020. He holds a bachelor's degree from Columbia University, a master's and architecture degree from Rice University, and is a licensed city planner. In addition to his work with the city of Annapolis, he is also the board chair at Maryland Hall for the Creative Arts. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you, Joe. Bring up my presentation. You seeing the first slide here?
Yep, looks great. Thanks, Eric.
Good to be with you. I see a lot of folks from around Maryland, outside of Maryland, across the country. Hopefully I can give you some food for thought here. On the left is the comprehensive plan that Joe mentioned that we had adopted by our city council in 2024. I'm going to be talking about that quite a bit today. Like to think that our public facilities have come a long way here in Annapolis. We're in our 4th century here. For those of you not familiar with Annapolis, it's the state capital, home of the Navy. And this was once our most prominent public facility, a rickety bridge crossing our major body of water. You can see the State House beyond. Great book if you want to know more about what Annapolis was like prior to the automobile. Today, our most modern public facility looks a little like this. This is Forest Drive in Annapolis, a major corridor that has the highest volume traffic in our area. We've been permitting projects up and down this corridor for decades, meeting our APF requirements, and yet I would be hard pressed to find somebody today who would deem this adequate. It's the corridor everybody loves to hate. I'm going to be talking about why that is, and just keep a mental picture of this. I'll come back to it later in the presentation. I want to point on the left. You can see a 4 or 5 foot sidewalk pushed right up against the curb. No one would deem that adequate by today's standards. On the right, we have a shared use path that is heavily used, a 10 foot wide bike and pedestrian strip. that's been very successful. So I'm going to step back. In contrast to some of what you heard today, I'm going to provide some of the conceptual underpinnings of an adequate public facility policy. I'm a comprehensive planner. I'm the chief of comprehensive planning for the city of Annapolis. So I'm a little biased towards our how we plan for these types of policies. But I'll start by just sharing the purpose statement of our adequate public facility policy here in the city of Annapolis. I'm going to zero in on this sentence here, which says, assure that development and redevelopment occurs in concert with the capital improvement program and will enable the city to provide adequate public facilities in a timely manner and achieve the growth objectives of the comprehensive plan as defined in Title 21. I want to emphasize that I actually have no issue with this statement or the purpose in general of our APF requirements here. I would say if folks don't have a reference to their comprehensive plan or their CIP, they need to have that. It gives you an opportunity to set that vision every time you do a comprehensive plan. Here in Maryland, we have a requirement to do an update every 10 years. So it allows us to reassess what is the vision of our city? What does growth look like? What should it look like? And it really ties the APF to that vision. This is what the vision looked like in our most recently adopted comprehensive plan. I just want to read the first paragraph here. In the coming years, Annapolis will be a more equitable, healthy, and resilient city. It will be a more walkable and connected city where multiple safe and reliable transportation options reduce personal vehicle dependency. It will be a city which prioritizes public investments in its most socially vulnerable communities, a city which expands housing options accessible to residents of all income levels, and a city which grows a community of diverse local entrepreneurs aided by inclusive economic programs and opportunities. Focusing on that paragraph because it's tied to growth principally, and it really establishes the relatedness between transportation and land use, housing and mobility. And there are different communities with different needs in our city, and we need to be mindful of that. On the right, two projects which exemplify the vision of growth that we're putting out in this plan are City Dock redevelopment, which is replacing a large parking lot on our most prized civic waterfront with a park. Seems like something we should have done years ago. And then below, redevelopment of our largest public housing community into a more dense, mixed income, mixed use model neighborhood that is more closely integrated with the rest of the city. We capture a vision of growth in our plan that's really critical to talking about APF. Here on the right is sort of the poster child for that. It's essentially an infill redevelopment along a neighborhood main street in West Annapolis where you have retail on the ground floor, apartments above. They're not affordable apartments per se to a large percentage of the population. We're asserting a value in mixed use development here and showing folks that it's not hard to do. It fits in, it's appropriate, it provides conveniences and addresses a lot of needs in this neighborhood. We want to talk about growth in a way that is specific and nuanced, specific to Annapolis. Everybody has a different understanding of what growth means. So in this comprehensive plan, it's not just about any type of development. It's about certain types of development that we want to see, that we want to encourage. We want to be mindful of situating people close to where they work and basically helping people see that the way we build has tremendous ramifications on our mobility network. And something I should have reinforced when I was showing you the initial slides is that transportation is somewhat unique in our APF, and I think in most jurisdictions' APF policies, where when you look at things like wastewater, water supply, stormwater management, school capacity, they're much more grounded in sort of a calculus on how much capacity do you have for new development, whereas transportation is asking us to make kind of value determinations. How should we be getting around? How should we be able to move freely? And when you look at the kind of corridors we have in the city today, they're by and large ones that have been subsidized for one type of transportation over all others, and that's the personal automobile. And then our zoning, just sort of knockout punch, is really incentivized kind of lowest density development pattern. So we're shifting the conversation into comprehensive plan. We're talking about mixed use development. We're talking about the kind of standards we want to have to get the best type of development that is efficient, minimizes resources. We have a very limited land base in Annapolis. We're essentially built out. And so we're really just looking at opportunities to redevelop in a more smart, sustainable way. And so these types of standards for mixed use development in the comprehensive plan are really key to that. We did some things to really underscore the case for mixed use development. It's not just quality of life. It has strong consequences for economic performance. Some of you may have done an analysis like this with the economic consultancy Urban 3. What this is showing us is our productivity by parcel within the city of Annapolis, where the height of these vertical extrusions represents the taxable value per acre. So everything in purple that's going sky high are highly productive parcels in the city, and you can see the hierarchy here, where everything in purple is our downtown area, and then the parole area of Annapolis at the edge of the city is also very productive in other ways. The surrounding area, less productive. And so the analysis helped us see that not all development is created equally. There's a return on investment to certain types of development that can help us recoup the costs of providing public facilities, can better pay for themselves. You can see the pattern here where large big box shopping centers provide relatively little value per acre compared to more intense mixed use developments. And you can look at it both in terms of commercial properties and residential properties. There's sort of analogous patterns here where you can really put together a chart like this that shows you exactly the kind of development that's going to yield a greater return on investment and be more efficient to maintain from a public infrastructure perspective. This is another way of looking at it where each row is a different type of development, residential, commercial, mixed use, and each column has a different density. And you can see just how dramatically different the taxable value is per acre when you change the density. And it's really, I think one of the takeaways is the value of the mixed use pattern is undeniable, particularly in places where you have limited land to pay for the services and infrastructure. As part of this, there was another aspect which was highly insightful, I think, particularly for people who think they know Annapolis, but maybe didn't know it well enough. And that's how the city has evolved over time is really interesting. This is basically showing the growth of our street network, starting in this historic period, 1700, 1800. We were actually founded in 1650. So we had a relatively small footprint that has grown outward. And then in 1951, the city annexed about 10 times its land at that point to create much of the city we have today. The problem was that was mostly farmland, and this was at the height of the suburban boom, so that the development pattern became very auto-oriented. And today, if you look at our population trajectory on the bottom here, our population density today is essentially what it was in 1820, because much of the city sort of got away from the early principles of smart, efficient land use, and became a city that wasn't really capable of paying for itself from an infrastructure perspective. So we have, miles and miles of infrastructure. We have enough roadway lane miles to get to Bridgeport, Connecticut. And we rely heavily on our property tax base to pay for it all. And so you have a map of the city. It looks like this, where much of the city is in the red. Of course, we don't talk about it that way because it has other benefits to the city, but everything in black, those aren't the heights of the buildings. Again, this is the value. Once you add in the cost of maintaining these properties, the ones in black are the ones that are productive and the ones that are in red are not. And this is the big takeaway, that everything built pre-1951 is essentially subsidizing a large portion of the city. So it's, I like to say we want to make Annapolis more Annapolis in how we grow and take lessons from these early historic development patterns that we got away from over the last 75 years. So our comprehensive plan has a few pages specifically talking about the APF, but then the rest of the document kind of goes into how we're going to address it. I want to point to, there's everything on this left column is addressed by our APF. The 5 items right here are the ones that we felt we could actually improve in the next 10 to 20 years. And transportation is the big one. We found this quote while we were working on the comprehensive plan from a former San Francisco MTA director that really distills the value in addressing mobility and ensuring that with every new development, you're really asking that development to meet the goals that you have and help get you to a better transportation environment. We live in a world where cities, counties are doing things like this in other parts of the world, where they're basically assessing the value of their transportation and land use pattern and realizing that they're putting what Mr. Tumlin put in his quote into practice and acknowledging that the mobility pattern can have tremendous impact on economic performance, quality of life, housing, etc. You may not be able to position to do something as dramatic as that, but there's a spectrum of change that we can look at. Safety is paramount in almost anywhere in this country, as we're seeing increases in fatalities and crashes. Our most vulnerable road users, often the victims. This heat map shows where those things are happening in Annapolis. And when you look at social vulnerability in our city, we use this analysis in our comprehensive plan using the CDC, Center for Disease Control's social vulnerability matrix of 15 criteria. In darker blue are the communities that are more socially vulnerable, structured, not surprisingly, along our Forest Drive corridor, which I showed at the beginning of this presentation. This just shows how the CDC mapped this information nationally using the same criteria. But there's an interesting relationship here where there's a strong direct correspondence between social vulnerability, racial composition in the middle. Essentially, the more multicolored areas are more diverse areas of our city. The light blue areas are more predominantly white communities. And then you can see the traffic patterns where the high rate of vehicle crashes corresponds to these other criteria. So these kind of factors then play into how we evaluate transportation. And in our APF, we do have a section on non-auto transportation facilities, but it has many references to adequacy, and yet doesn't really get to what that means. The closest we come to is this goal statement, which says the goal of adequate bicycle, pedestrian, transit facilities is to increase accessibility and to ensure reasonable and accessible alternatives to automobile travel. But what does that look like? Well, complete streets is something that a lot of places are looking at. We are too. How can we redesign our streetscapes to be more safe and comfortable to all road users? We have an updated bike system map that helps to fill in the gaps in our network so it becomes an actual functional network. We have a range of transit options that go well beyond the traditional fixed route bus service today. And we want our APF to address these types of things as much as our traditional fixed route service. And we ultimately have a map that's trying to show how our transportation network, this kind of reimagined transportation network, can connect our city, particularly our parks, schools, and population job centers. This is what we call the Greenway map. It shows up in a few locations in our comp plan. And I just want to finish by saying it's not enough to be thinking about how the APF for transportation works, but where are we getting people? What are the destinations in your city? And that's where the recreational facilities come into play. Our APF for recreation is very basic and non-specific. It talks about the goal being just simply that proposed projects contribute to and are served by adequate recreational facilities. Adequacy is just simply based on the amount of square feet of public recreational space per single family detached dwelling unit. There's really no qualitative understanding of what that looks like or should be. Well, it just so happens that we have a lot of water around us, 22 miles or thereabouts, and very little of it is publicly accessible. So we've been making a lot of effort to figure out how we can make this more central to our recreational adequate public facilities policies. We did a separate plan. We included it in our comprehensive plan, but we did a separate study that looked specifically at equitable public water access, identified 63 recommendations. And so this is the next step. It's how do we be more willful and strategic in our APF for recreation, just as we're looking to do for transportation, to basically make sure that the APF is working towards our vision of a more connected, equitable, resilient city. And I just want to close with this image, which is on that same corridor that I showed at the very beginning, Forest Drive, where if you go there today during peak hours, where this is rush hour just a few days ago, you can see one of the newest infill redevelopment projects. This is happy to say supported by the state of Maryland. This is a subsidized housing community called the Willows. Because we had this comprehensive plan in place and understanding of our vision for the future, we could enforce the need for this shared use path to continue past the development as part of their meeting their APF requirements, and becomes part of a long-term vision. There's another project just beyond this that's going to be extending this even further. So happy to take any questions that we have time for. I'm going to hand it back to the moderator at this point.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you to all the panel. David, if you could bring up the Q&A slide. We have more questions than we can answer in 10 minutes, which usually happens, but we will do our best. I'll try to consolidate some together, and we'll get through what we can get through. These topics generated a lot of interest. I'm going to start off with you, David. it was a question about, I think they were specifically asking about the school that you mentioned closing, and if you knew why it closed, or if there was any indication in the report about another school opening elsewhere, or just any information you have about like the kind of stuff that's reported to in the biennial reports.
Well, those specific closures were in Howard County. They look every year to see capacities, and they will determine whether or not a school district is closed or open based on student rated capacities. And so it's every year there's an allocation that's granted, and they close and open schools. How schools are reopened, generally it's because either a new school comes online or they've rebuilt a school that's added additional capacity. So those are the two main ways. I do know that Howard County also was going through a redistricting process, and maybe that was one of the reasons why some of those schools became open again.
Great. Thank you, David. Sarah, next question for you. It's a little preview of your report, which we'll be publishing shortly. It's talking about, does the report specify the jurisdictions that have an affordable housing test exemption, or is it aggregated?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, in the inventory, but also the report, there's a appendix that includes all the tables that summarizes for each jurisdiction that has an APFO, what the exempted developments are. So there's a whole table. It's quite lengthy, but it goes through each jurisdiction and what their exempted developments are, either for the entire APFO policy or for specific facilities that are covered. So in that, you can see which ones, which jurisdictions have affordable housing listed as exempted development.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Well, there was a lot of questions. We'll try to put this one together, and I can't say I'll do a great job of it. There are a lot of questions, and Eric started talking about it with the land value analysis. A lot of Urban 3 fans in the chat. But there's a question about, APFO, a couple questions to this, like APFOs, as often designed, can do an excellent job of discouraging or managing growth in certain areas where, the infrastructure might not be there to support it. But what about either using APFOs or other potential tools to, get this growth in the desired areas, infill, to hit that land value that we're all seeking. It's kind of delves into a different topic than just APFOs, but if somebody has any insight on how either APFOs or something similar could be used, there are a lot of questions about this.
I'll jump in real quick. In Charles County, we had an area, our Waldorf Urban Redevelopment District, that was rezoned in 2010 to be mixed-use, transit-oriented development. It's a perfect area to accommodate various levels of housing, especially high density. No movement on it in 10 years. And when we made the 2020 policy changes, it incentivized and granted full school allocations to projects locating within that area. And that made a huge difference in terms of attracting things. Once we made that policy change, all of a sudden we started seeing multifamily projects in the area as well as mixed use. That was a key incentive to seeing an area that we really wanted to redevelop actually happen, because schools are such a limiting factor in our county.
Thank you. Eric, it looked like you had unmuted. You want to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah, although we don't currently structure our APF based on major corridors or districts, as Jason was describing, I don't see why we couldn't do that. I think there's different standards that should be met along our high volume corridors and where we're trying to steer certain types of development. It seems like the APF should be proportionate to that. That's something we're looking at with our zoning update. It should be probably reflected in our APF as well.
Okay. Thank you. There was a couple questions about different changing household size, particularly with the younger generations, and how does that connect back to calculations of student yield factors. I know Jason, you dealt with this the most, but I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on how their jurisdictions are considering different household sizes now when they're developing APFOs or considering school capacity.
I'll jump in really quickly. So we don't have currently a significant amount of anomalies, where you've got multi-generational families that are producing a significant enough amount of students per household where they're going outside of the average. There's enough flexibility in the system to accommodate it currently.
Great. Thank you. There's a couple questions. I think they came in during your section, Melissa, about APFO tests or APFO considerations for particularly pedestrian infrastructure and how that might be considered.
Sure. So our APFO doesn't actually account for specific standards for pedestrian or multimodal transportation, although we do have the ability to include an analysis of that as part of our PAPF to include it in the traffic study if that's required. But this is one of those situations where we have other plans and factors in the county to account for that. So we have a community planning group here in our planning division, and they review for sidewalk requirements and whatnot for all of the different applications that come in, and they administer the county's bicycle and pedestrian master plan and our sub-area plans that account for pedestrian transportation requirements and some of our corridor specific plans like our Waldorf urban redevelopment that Jason was speaking about. So while it's not specifically accounted for as far as standards go in our APFO, it is still looked out for by other groups and other plans and policies and procedures in the county.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. There's one question. There's only one question about this, but I thought it was a really good one that if anybody would like to share, specifically about interjurisdictional coordination on APFOs or testing, whereas many of the facilities are used across jurisdictional lines. This could be municipal to county, definitely with schools, or even county to county. Any thoughts on that or examples?
Yeah, I should have mentioned during my presentation that we have a really close working relationship with our county, Anne Arundel County, regarding schools in particular, also transportation. But with schools, we rely heavily on the annual facilities master plan that the county board of, excuse me, Anne Arundel County Public Schools puts out that really assesses the capacity issues, enrollment, up-to-date enrollment numbers, and future projects. And we feed them information, and then they feed us information. And then within the city, we do a twice-a-year assessment of what the enrollments look like and factor in pipeline development projects to really get a pretty specific look at which schools might be close to capacity. And it seems to have worked out well. So that's, I mean, we updated our code just a few years ago for that, our APF requirements. So that seems to be working pretty well for us at this point.
Eric. We really only have time for one more question. I'm sorry if we couldn't get to yours, but this is a question I think we have, since we have a national audience, you saw all the things coming in, all the different locations coming in. Somebody mentioned that their state doesn't have enabling authority for APFOs. So are there any lessons learned from your APFO work at the local level, or Sarah or David, anything that could inform something? While they might not be able to do an APFO, they could still, best practice for maintaining adequate public facilities without that enabling ability. I know it's a tough question.
I can hop
Sarah,
in here just add one quick thing. I think going back to a point that Melissa made and then also that David made in his presentation at the beginning, that there's sort of other mechanisms and policies that could be used to plan for and accommodate for growth. And also the capital improvements programming was a really key part of the research I found on APFOs. So I think even if a formal APFO is not implemented, I think really coordinating that capital improvements program with growth would be a key way that you could achieve some of the same results.
Yeah, I would add to, like Sarah was saying, look at other mechanisms, whether it's a TIF district or something else that you can get it. I mean, we heard about excise taxes, and then Eric also showed in his code where it has adequate, and what does that mean? And a lot of APFO ordinances in Maryland, even though they're allowed to do it, they don't define what adequate means. So it doesn't, even though you may not have the enabling legislation, it doesn't mean you can't have a definition and manage what your facility capacities are and how they relate back to development and promoting development and accommodating development.
Thank you. All right, we are at time. Again, I'm sorry if I didn't get your question, but we will be sharing the presentations with everybody, and you'll be able to. We have the contact information for our panels on there. We encourage you to reach out to them with any additional questions. I know there was a question again in the chat about the AICP credits. I know if you weren't here at the very beginning, I don't have AICP credits yet because if you are an APA member, you probably realized that their website is went under some major construction last month, and you cannot access, or at least I have not been able to process AICP credits for 2 weeks. And I do anticipate, they have not responded to my inquiries, but I do anticipate that will be fixed soon because I'm sure I'm not the only one contacting about this. We will make sure to share the presentations, the recording, and once I get the AICP credits secured, I will share that number with you and let you all know. So you will still be able to log your hours. A lot of happy holidays in the chat, and I wish the same to the panel as well. Thank you all so much for doing this so far into December, and I thank you for your time, and everybody have a good week. It's just Monday, so thank you.